Welcome back to the podcast. And today I want to talk about something that doesn't get enough airtime, definitely in sales training. And to be honest with you, it's something I've been thinking about for a while. Because if you look at the research on what makes a great salesperson, so these are things like empathy, listening, building genuine trust, reading the room, asking better questions, focusing on the client's problem rather than your own target. That list sounds a lot like a description of a lot of the women I know for sure, and possibly a lot of the women you know too. And yet, if you look at the top 10 salespeople in most organizations, it really doesn't reflect that. So leadership pipelines tend not to reflect it either. And if you disagree with me, I'm very, very happy to hear from you in the comments, in the messages, whatever. However, if you're seeing the same thing, and when you ask why it's like that, the answers are rarely satisfying. So this episode is called The Invisible Tax. And it's about what women in sales carry that never shows up on the leaderboard, and really what top performers do to turn their strengths into an explicit owned advantage. So I want to be really clear. This isn't a grievance episode. It's about performance, which is what a lot of the podcasts are about, improving your performance. And particularly if you're a team manager, then obviously you want the whole team performing. That's really important. And obviously, that comes down to individual sales skills. It also comes down to the kind of environment that you create for your people. And you might also be a woman in sales, or just someone who wants to understand why some of the best salespeople you know aren't the ones getting promoted. So if any of that strikes chord with you, then let's get into it. So I want to start with what I mean by the invisible tax. So the invisible tax is basically an additional cognitive and emotional load that women carry in sales environments that often male colleagues simply, not only do they not have to think about it, they may not even be aware of it. And speaking as a white male, there are a lot of things I take for granted that for a woman would be very, very different. So it's the calculation that happens before a sales call. It's how do I project confidence without being labeled aggressive? How do I push back on a prospect without losing the warmth that's been building the relationship or is underpinning the relationship? And how assertive is too assertive in a particular room? So it's the way authority has to be earned differently. And for a lot of men in sales, authority is assumed until lost. But for a lot of women, it has to be demonstrated before it's granted. And sometimes, even after it's demonstrated, it gets attributed to something else. So she got lucky, she's good with people, he's a natural closer, whatever it might be. So it's a double blind of likability and performance. And research consistently shows that women are evaluated on both and that the two can work against each other. So if you're too warm, you're not taken seriously. If you're too direct, you're difficult. And that's a really narrow lane to have to operate in. It's a very energy draining way of operating. You're constantly trying to find the balance in any given room with any given group. So, and this is the thing I want to be really clear about. This isn't about victimhood. I'm not into victimhood. I'm not about victims. I don't want to work with victims. Most of the top performing women in sales that I've encountered or read about don't spend much time on this, and that's really important. But naming it is important. It does matter, because if you're carrying this load and nobody's ever acknowledged it, you might have internalized it as a personal failing, as something that you need to fix about yourself. And frankly, that's the wrong diagnosis. So the invisible tax is real. The environment created it. And top performers do find ways to reduce it or even make it irrelevant. And that's really what I want to look at in this podcast. And as I've said, just make it more visible that this is a real situation that goes on. So this is what's interesting, and it should also be genuinely encouraging if you're a woman in sales or if you lead a team and you're wondering why your pipeline looks the way it does. The skills that buyers actually want from salespeople are shifting. So I'm going to refer to it as the old model. This high pressure, high volume, close at all costs is dying, and it's a system I've loathed. I worked in it. I worked alternatively to that. So the good news is that's dying, and buyers have more information than ever. In fact, the whole way of buying is changing. They can research your product before you even pick up the phone. You might not even know that they're researching your product. But what they can't get from a website or ChatGPT or some other IP thing they're using to get a shortlist is trust. And trust is built through the exact skills that women in sales tend to score higher on. So that's consultative selling, which is something I push a lot. It's what I've called my course. Empathy, active listening, really important. Question quality, absolutely vital. Relationship depth, very, very important. And these aren't soft skills. In complex, high-value business-to-business sales, these are the differentiators. So these are not nice to haves. These are absolutely vital that you have them in your sales people and in your sales approach. And the gap between what women bring to sales and where they end up in sales organizations, it isn't a capability gap. It's a visibility gap. It's a sponsorship gap. It's a self-advocacy gap. Sometimes because they've been conditioned to let results speak for themselves in environments where results don't always get attributed correctly. And as I've said earlier, some salespeople do well and it's just put down to them getting lucky. There's no acknowledgement of the skills and the abilities they've had to demonstrate to get to that point. So here's the reframe that I wanted to sit with. The problem isn't you. But top performers don't wait for the environment to change. They work with what they have. They build visibility deliberately, and they own their approach rather than adapting it to fit a model that was never designed for them. So that is where, as a woman, particularly in this podcast, is where you take control. So let's get practical. What does that actually look like? So the first thing that I notice in top performing women in sales is that they own their style rather than mirroring it. So early in a sales career, there's often pressure, and it can be spoken, it can be unspoken, but the pressure's there to adopt the behaviors of whoever's at the top of the leaderboard, whoever is the top salesperson or who is regarded as such within that organization. And if those people are predominantly male, which can often be the case, that can mean mimicking an approach that doesn't feel natural to a saleswoman and doesn't land the same way. And the most effective women I've encountered, they do the opposite. They double down on what they're good at. They lean into the depth of their discovery questions. They build genuine rapport that creates loyalty, not just transactions. They make the sale about the client's problem, and it's in a way that feels real, and it's real because basically it is real, and they're not apologetic about it. The second thing is that they build internal visibility deliberately, not just external results. And this one is important because in many sales organizations, visibility comes from volume and noise. So the rep who shouts the loudest about their wins gets the attention. And if that isn't your style, and for a lot of people it isn't, you need to find another way. So that might mean being more deliberate about sharing what you're working on in team meetings. It might mean building relationships with senior stakeholders, not just your direct manager. It might mean documenting your wins in a way that makes them impossible to attribute ambiguously. And none of this is political game playing. It's just recognizing that results that aren't visible don't get rewarded. And unfortunately, this is a truth that a lot of people, particularly young salespeople, and I've worked with a few, male and female, just don't get. So this is really, really important. Now, thirdly, they reframe authority. So authority in sales doesn't have to come from volume or aggression. It comes from expertise. It comes from preparation, from the quality of your questions. So when you walk into a room knowing more about the client's business than they expected, well, that's authority. When you ask a question that makes a senior buyer stop and think, that's authority. These are forms of authority that don't require you to be the loudest person in the room. So please remember that if you're not aware of this. And fourth, and this one matters more than people admit, they choose their environment carefully. So not every sales organization is built to value the way top performing women sell. Some still reward the old model. It's unfortunate, but this is the truth. And if you're in one of those, you're fighting two battles. You're performing and justifying your approach. The most successful people I know have been deliberate about finding companies and managers, and perhaps the managers even more important, where consultative, relationship-led selling is not just tolerated, but it's celebrated. That's not selling, that's just smart, frankly. So if you are a team leader, please take that on board if you haven't taken it on board already. And then fifthly, they stop seeking approval and start seeking outcomes. This is the mindset shift that probably makes the biggest difference. So approval seeking, which is needing a prospect to like you, to validate you, to give you a signal that you're doing well, is often the thing that kills deals. And they did a whole podcast on this about how being liked or that need to be liked can really be messing up your sales deals. So once you become outcome seeking, that means you're focused on the client's problem. You're focused on what needs to happen for this to be a win for them. And that is a fundamental shift in how you handle pushbacks, in how you ask for the business. It's how you handle silence. And this is exactly what buyers respond to. And I say this, I don't know if in every podcast, but most podcasts. But your role as a salesperson is to be the problem solver for your client. You want to become their go-to person when something goes wrong and they need a solution. So that's what you can do, or at least some suggestions on what you can do. But what about sales leaders? So if you're a sales leader listening to this, and I know a good number of you are, I just want to spend a couple of minutes on what this means for you, because some of this isn't about the individual. It's actually about the environment you're building. And I have to say, when I first got into sales management, that was probably the one thing that excited me more than anything else. It allowed me to build an environment that people could grow in. I've worked for some good sales managers. I've worked for some really bad sales managers. And that, for me, was probably the biggest part of that opportunity. Now, bias in sales organizations tends to be systemic rather than deliberate. It shows up in pipeline reviews where deals are scrutinized differently depending on who's presenting them. It shows up in territory allocation where high potential accounts don't always go to the highest potential sellers. It shows up in coaching conversations where the same behavior gets labeled differently depending on the person who is producing that behavior. Now, none of that requires bad intent, but it does require active attention to fix it. So the practical question for you is, are you evaluating your team's performance on the behaviors that actually predict results? So that's quality of discovery, depth of client relationships, how they handle late-stage resistance. Or are you defaulting to whoever makes the most noise in the morning meeting? And the important thing here is that the organizations that figure this out tend to win because they end up with, more of sellers. They produce the kind of salespeople that buyers want to deal with. And they're the kind of people that buyers want to do business with. And once you've got a buyer who wants to buy from you, or at least wants to do business with you rather than somebody else, you are already a long way to closing that deal. Basically, the deals are there for you to lose. So just in closing, I want to just leave you with this. The sales industry is moving. It's slow, but it is moving towards exactly the skills that women have always brought to the table. Buyers are more sophisticated. Relationships matter more, not less. And trust is the differentiator. So the real question is whether you'll own that, whether you'll stop waiting to be recognized for an approach that was undervalued by an old model and start positioning it as exactly what the modern model, modern selling, actually requires. Because it is. The invisible tax is real, but so is the advantage if you choose to use it. And that's what today's episode is all about. So hopefully this one resonated with you. If it did, please share it with somebody who needs to hear it, whether that's a woman in sales who's perhaps been grinding away in the wrong environment, or a sales leader who wants to build a better team, build an environment where that team can really flourish and thrive and grow, not an environment where salespeople are constantly looking over their shoulder because they just don't know what's going on behind them. And I have worked in environments like that, and I can tell you it's a really unpleasant place to be. So please remember to like and subscribe. As I say, please remember to share, and I will speak to you in the next podcast. Thanks for listening, and bye for now. Just before I go, if you're in sales, you already know that effective communication with your client is essential to making sales. But unfortunately, most struggling salespeople that I've spoken to make the mistake of assuming that everybody communicates in the same way. Well, they don't. And in order to help you with that, I am running a series of 4 free webinars, and they start on the 2nd of June. And they run at 6:30 p.m. Sydney time, but that doesn't matter. If you're in a different time zone, that's fine, because they're all recorded. They're all about up to 30 minutes long, so they're pretty short. And I will take you through the 4 styles, how to recognize them, and what you need to do to change your approach so that you really connect with people very, very easily. So they're running from the 2nd of June. Please go to the link in the description. And please remember to like and subscribe. That's it from me. Bye for now.